Hey, good evening, everybody. Um, Back in the saddle here with Woodstock TV, and uh, my gratitude goes out to Steve Romine, whose aegis has made this show happen tonight, and for Paula Gloria, who is again making a lovely show with her teching skills. And I'm always grateful for that as well. And grateful for the facility here. So it's been about a month or so, month and a half since I did a show that I can remember anyway. And I've been very busy fighting the good fight, as they say. And a lot of things have kind of come to light and grinding along in my kerfuffle in the courts, as I like to think of it. But there's a lot to share with you guys tonight. This could be among the last shows that I'm going to be able to put out, depending on the outcome of certain elements to putting out a show here. And, so in the spirit of community, I just like to let you all know that I'd like to keep doing shows, and this is my community, and I feel that anybody who would like to see my show continue and some new and interesting content come out, it would be real great for some support in that direction, and you can direct that support for the Woodstock TV producers, to our town supervisor, or Bill McKenna, and let them know that you'd like to keep the producers producing, and me being one of them. So there's that. Just on another note. Before I get into some other ideas here, is I had on the last couple of shows talked quite seriously about our environment, all right, and there's a few interesting things that have happened recently. One of them is the local Saugerties police chief, Chief Sinagra, has shut down one of the illegal dumps that were operating on Goat Hill Road, which is the borderlands of Woodstock and West Saugerties. And that is a very important and strong move. The owner of that property, where the construction materials from God knows where has been coming into our watershed here and dumping it. Some of it seems to include things like heavy metals such as cadmium. I'm not certain about all of that, but I think a little bit of acknowledgement to Saugerties Police Chief Sinagra for making that move under a great deal of resistance, I might add, is something very positive for protecting our local environment. Now, that directly affects a lot of people downstream from Goat Hill, whose wells could be impacted by such illegal kinds of dumping operations. So there's that. More importantly, there is a quality that has reared its head here in Ulster County in terms of how procedure and process and law enforcement and judicial machinery operate. But it's not just Ulster County, really. It's the world. I did a few shows, and I read some really fascinating documents on the history of the courts. And some of that history was discussed, goes right back to Sumeria and, these very ancient civilizations that have preceded our modern age, and how much of what we're experiencing today is part of, like, you could almost call it a design or a playbook. And that playbook has a real interesting origin. And when people are confronted with the jaws of the judicial machinery that is, in theory, to regulate society in a civil and orderly way, and fair and lawful, we really need to look into the history of, well, what is lawful, what's not lawful, what's fair, what's not fair. And I think about certain things. Sometimes you'll see, say on social media like Facebook, somebody will post a little picture of something, and one of these little things might be something like, everything you need to know in life you learn by the time you're in second grade. The real rules of life are formed, in that time. And I kind of laughed when I saw that little thing, years and years ago. But I think there's a truth to a natural sense of justice. Okay, it gets real simple in a certain way. It's if you all have heard I'm sure you all have heard the expression, taking a lollipop from a baby, right? And what's the baby do? Baby cries, "Hey, you took my lollipop." That's not fair. You're bigger and stronger and meaner than me. And so when we talk about the real ancient laws, they were based upon barter, basically. I mean, you have a real root of true cosmic law. And the cosmic law, also sometimes called natural law, really involves how our universe is constructed and how it works, and the operating principles underneath that. And when we translate that into, say, science, you can go into two branches really here, or a number of branches anyway. Science could be one and religion could be another. And sometimes the two come and mingle, certain leaves of those branches can touch each other. All right, but from a science point of view, natural law would include things like, objects fall because of gravity. Not that we know what gravity is, but there it is. Objects fall, and that kind of begins the scientific inquiry into truth. Now, that's a big one right there. Truth. And that's really the preeminent objective of science and law, curiously enough. Because you can't have a just decision if truth isn't spoken and presented. So in science, you can't prove a theory without an experiment that has a repeatable, provable, and repeatable outcome. All right? So, that's where this idea of cosmic law comes in, is that's what science is trying to first identify and then define. And they're identifying the operative truths of our reality. Now, how does that translate to, something practical in our lives? Well, it comes to, say, a conveyance such as an automobile or a horse-drawn buggy even. You still have to deal with things called physics and materials and how to put them together. All right? So if you want to make a horse and buggy, a successful horse and buggy, you have to design it and engineer it based upon these principles that the scientists, of their day had figured out how to make things work. How do you stabilize a wheel shaft? How do you make the carriage run smoothly over the rutty roads being pulled by a horse? They had to devise, things that became known as leaf springs that were eventually used in automobiles that were powered instead of by 2 or 3 or 6 horses by hundreds of horses in an internal combustion engine. And that evolution of science looks for, the truth in the cosmic root of things. So you have things like friction, or you have things like inertia, you have things like resistance, or you have things like, how the behavior of fluid, fluid dynamics. Does water run uphill? Actually, it can in the right circumstances. But generally speaking, no, water runs downhill. So you have these operating principles that eventually we think of as natural law or, axioms of science, proven concepts as beyond theory, but more in the land of fact. Now we're getting into the land of truth and fact, and that's where law is supposed to be empirical, right? Deducing the truth from the evidence. Is it repeatable? Is the experiment repeatable and reliable? This kind of thing. And if I'm wandering, I'm doing this show off the cuff, folks. So I'm kind of in a dimension of flow of thought, right? As a train of thought, flow of thought. There's a word I'm looking for that. But in any event, I'm focusing on how cosmic law came down to earth, okay? How it translates into our lives today in the context of the road that our species has been on for thousands of years. And that comes in with that certain ideas, going back to, say, Hammurabi, the Assyrian, or the Sumerian experience, which we're learning actually more and more about as the cuneiform records of that age. Millions of these cuneiform documents are being deciphered over the last 100 years now, 150 years or better even. And many of these documents describe business transactions. In fact, most of them do. So-and-so traded 16 bushels of wheat for, so-and-so's 30, lambs, this kind of thing. So there was detailed records kept in this civilization, written on clay tablets that were fired and made hard like stone for the ages. For why? What compelled that civilization to record so much of its activity? Good question. I don't know. Just looking at it. But the laws are interesting because the laws had to reflect mostly the fairness of commerce. And that's why there are so many millions of these transaction records. And these transaction records, funny to this day, also include things like marriages, divorces, separations, many of the same societal issues and problems and conflicts were recorded 8,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago. And the complexity of living in an urban situation, some people could call it civilization, and some people might call it city-states. That's another one that they would refer to these ancient cities and villages and such. City-states exhibit many of the same, exactly the same dynamics of the human condition that we have today. And that speaks to me loudly in a lot of ways. But anyway, coming back to the honesty part of the transaction, at some point, money was invented, folks. And this is kind of where the shell game really begins. Now, it was known in ancient times that if you were promising your bushel of wheat to really be a bushel of wheat and it weighed so many potatoes, whatever their measure was, we call it pounds or ounces or liters, or, we have different metrics or measurement systems today, but it goes all the way back 9,000 years. So if you promised 9 bushels of wheat, they're supposed to weigh 32 pounds each, something like that, right? I'm just making stuff up, folks, but just as an example. For, so many lambskins, and maybe throw in a real live lamb and maybe a calf or something, then the two farmers could trade, and they would have, the wheat grower would have some meat and skins, and the meat and skin guy would have some wheat. And that was how, the economy of the day would operate. And it could only operate smoothly if everybody was happy, because otherwise then you would have chaos breaking out, and wheat wouldn't get traded and meat wouldn't get traded, and people would go hungry or wars would break out. So honesty was real important in order for the business structure, the business model to work properly. People are responsible for the integrity of that. And I hope that this is making sense to you all out there. Okay, so a curious thing happened as the agricultural economy and the urban living interfaced, because trade became far, far more important than just, farmers bartering, keeping their families alive. It became, there's farmers and ranchers out in the plains who had to sell their goods to the cities. And now maybe they weren't selling their goods. Maybe there was still barter and trade going on in those early city states. We don't know, except for what the clay tablets tell us, But at a certain point, it became very cumbersome to be trading all the time in terms of the barter and trade, because you have to commensurate the deal with everything on the table right then and there, or make a promise and keep it or not keep it, and then that would add another dimension of complexity to a system. Okay, you need to understand that the more complex a system, the more opportunity for failure there is. The simpler the system, economic, mechanical, doesn't matter. The simpler a system is, the less opportunity for failure. And how can we identify failure when we're talking about law? How can we identify a business system failure when we're talking about commerce? Well, one of them is fraud, cheating your neighbor. It's just that simple. And, one of the ways of cheating your neighbor 8,000 years ago is to have, 10 pounds of rocks in your 32-pound bucket of wheat at the bottom of the thing. And then when the farmer goes and he gets his wheat home, he finds out that he's got 10 pounds of rocks in the bottom of his wheat. And he's been cheated. And then he has to go to an arbiter, a judge, somebody, to get the rest of his wheat. And for the deal to be made honest. Well, as this system economic model had to evolve because populations grew in these urban centers, and not everybody was out raising cattle or milking sheep or, growing wheat, because then you had the metalsmiths. You had metallurgy. Metallurgy was alive and well 8,000 years ago, and so was the making of bricks. And so was the making of things, okay? So you had manufacturing going on 8,000 years ago in the urban centers, and those people needed to eat. So then they would trade their goods, say farming implements, for wheat or meat, okay? Or wine or grapes or vegetables, whatever was being traded and whatever was needed, right? Supply and demand. The business model of barter is a natural business model, and it evolves naturally out of the supply and the need. And honesty for the system to work. Wars get started over dishonest business deals. That's how important it is that honesty and integrity, in order for a society to function properly, is. That's how it's really a critical thing. So somewhere along the line, money was invented. And here's where integrity and honesty and cosmic law and man's law take a real diverse direction. Because with the invention of money, the kings and robber baron merchants, whatever you want to call the money people of that time, they knew what they were doing. And I'll tell you why. They knew what they were doing because if you invent currency, which is to put a value, a quantitative value on this currency, and let's say the currency is silver and gold. Let's throw copper in there too. We call it coinage. We call it money, right? So that coinage, that money, 3 shekels or 3 dinars or, 3 pieces of silver, that's my bushel of wheat over there, okay? So now you have this exchange medium. That's what money is. It is a medium of exchange, which in effect is like a middleman in a deal. Okay? It's like I'm brokering the meat and the wheat, and I get a cut of the deal. Okay? Money is sort of that guy in a way. And I'll tell you how. When you have money as a medium of exchange, in order for the money to work fairly, what has to happen? Well, all the players have to be honest. The guy who's making the wheat has to be honest in his deal, and the meat guy has to be honest, and the guy who's tending the money, let's call him, a banker. The middleman, right? The money changers in the temple, they had a wonderful opportunity to make trades dishonestly, and nobody would know the better. And that is because money, as the medium of exchange, can be manipulated in these fictitious ways. And going back to when money was invented, many of the very same monetary scams that we live with today started happening right when money was invented. One of them is taxing you. So the king needs his tribute. He was getting, out of every, 6 bushels, he would get a bushel of wheat, and that would be his tribute for you. That's the taxes for you to stay on the farmland. See? You got a thought there, Paula?
Well, part of that was supposed to protect the farmer from marauders. The tax was to protect the farmer.
Oh, yeah, protection money. There's good old protection money. Yeah, that still goes on in the city under different guises. But yeah.
No, but that's the only reason for government, is protection.
Sure.
You want to be protected from your rights, and you pay a little fee.
Right.
The problem is when the fee becomes the problem.
Right. Well, there's not actually. There's a lot of problems. So I did this exercise once because I got curious about this thought. This thought came to me decades and decades ago because I used to think a lot about our economy and our future and our past and what the heck are we doing as a collective entity? What are we doing? What are we all doing here? Right? Why are we having all these wars? So I would think about it, and so I learned about a technique for making a decision, and this was used by apparently Ben Franklin, good old Ben Franklin. And the idea is you take a piece of paper and you draw a line down the middle, and at the top of the heading of it, you would have your question. This is what I want, to decide on. So you have your problem that you're looking at the top of the page, and then on the left side would be positive outcomes with making this decision, and on the right side would be negative, or do it either way. Positive outcomes and negative outcomes. So if I go with this decision, how will this affect me in a positive way? How will this affect me in a negative way? Or if you're a politician, how will this affect my constituency positively? And how will it? So he would go down and whatever the topic was, whatever the theme of his decision making process was, at the end of this assessment, if one side was significantly bigger than the other, then that's the direction he would lean in his answer. So if it would do more harm than good, then he'd go against the decision. If it would do more good than harm, then he would go with the decision, and he would make that decision. And I thought that was very clever. I said, that's great. And I thought to myself, hey, wait a minute. How about if I just put money at the top of the page, and then I'll draw a line underneath, and the question is what good can I do with money, and what bad can I do with money? Well, let's see. I can earn money. That's good. I can pay my bills. That's nice. I can buy stuff. That's great. What kind of naughty stuff can I do with money? Well, I could loan it for a high interest. I can gather that money dishonestly. I can steal it. I can leverage it. I can convert it. Money laundering. I can embezzle with it. I can bribe with it. And I quickly saw that on the negative side of the page of all the naughty things you could do with money really kind of outstripped all the good stuff you could do in a hurry.
I don't agree.
What's your thought on that?
I think as long as money is, and you're not cheating on the value. Those negative things you can do without money. You can create slander. You can have innuendo about someone's reputation. That doesn't involve money, but it's just as damaging. I'm saying on the negative side. On the positive side, I mean, look at our money is launched with the full faith and credit of the American people. So it doesn't have any value until you redeem the debt. It's debt-based. It's a value based on the full faith and credit of the American people, what they will produce. So if you start cheating, like in other words, when you make a bank loan, you're supposed to be the beneficiary of the contract. Timothy Geithner, I don't know if he's still the guy, the comptroller, he's supposed to discharge the debt. In other words, if the American people are converting their access to resources in return for participating in this system, then they're supposed to have certain things taken care of in their old age, their health care, if they need a house or if they need cars. But none of these things are happening. That's the problem. It's the cheating. It's not the money.
Well, there you go. There's the word. Is the honesty, is the integrity. The honesty of the system and the integrity of the system. No, I got it backwards. The integrity of an economic system, or a financial system, or a legal system, or even a scientific system, all comes back to truth and honesty. Without truth and honesty, there is no integrity. And what I was trying to point out in this little exercise on
I just
paper,
meant that money's abstract, that's all.
money
It's just
is
an
abstract. And what I was trying to say is, you know, you could cheat your neighbor in the barter system without the medium of exchange of money. You could throw rocks in the bottom of your wheat. You could sell rotten meat. I mean, yes, those bad things happened, but those bad things were very visible. They were tactile, and they were physical things that were argued over and disputed over, and a lot of law was written because of that. This is true. What I'm talking about is all the invisible things that become an opportunity for a dishonest acquisition of money. In other words, the problem with money is that it presents an opportunity to acquire it in dishonest ways. Whereas to go to a farmer's field and steal 30 bushels of wheat, you have to go out there, you have to cut the wheat down, and then, get it in the bushels and try to get it off the field. You see what I'm saying? You're going to get caught. I'm being simplistic, but the illustration works. Whereas when you're skimming money from a hedge fund, or any number of ways of manipulating money, it's abstract, and in its being abstract, as you're just pointing out, the opportunity for the fraud is exponential compared to trying to run away with some meat from the farmer when he's chasing you with an axe.
Exponential.
Is exponential.
That's
and now, we get into
that's why moral integrity is more important than ever, as it gets exponential. And that's why reputation and access to the public right-of-way is important, so the community knows who's reputable and who isn't.
Oh, we've got an incoming call.
Let's see. Woodstock TV.
Paul, that's me. What time do you think you're going to get home?
Oh, I'm recording right now.
So
after 8. Got to go.
All right. So we had a little phone call come in.
That was Joe.
All right. Now, one of the reason I'm talking about all of this is relative to a judicial machinery, law enforcement machinery issue that, or
It's critical, George.
action.
It's critical because that's what redeems the debt.
Yes.
It doesn't have any value until the debt's collected, and our courts are commercial in their debt collecting.
Okay, so that brings me back to where I was started with the history of all of this, and in some of my previous shows, it discussed that the original courts, well, at least the very early courts, as we understand it from, say, Sumeria, were also involved with the temple. And the temple is like, for lack of a better description, the house of God. All right. Now, in cosmic law, or in the thinking on cosmic law, the ultimate judge is, by some reckoning, this guy called God. The house of truth, but when we start getting into our modern age here, we have a system that was rooted in is deeply ritualized. If any of you have been involved with the courts, you will very quickly see that you have a ritualized thing that's gosh, awful similar to church. If you've ever been in church, now I don't know how synagogues work or how what do you call those mosques. I'm not sure how those religious institutions operate, but I was brought up in the Roman Catholic thingy, and there was a lot of getting up and down and kneeling and the murmuring of incantations and prayers and stuff. And, I mean, it was all very ritualized. And you had this guy up there at the altar, doing a, ritual and with his invocations and murmurings and such. Anyway, the idea is that our courts are directly related to that very same structure. And it goes to this entity called Baal, or Baal worship, and that is capital Baal, all right? And that's the ancient Sumerian god of Babylon, I think. In any event, many city-states would have their own god and their own altar to their own god. Or and maybe 3 or 4 different city-states would share the same god. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe my god's better than your god. There was this kind of thing going on. But in any event, how it translated as the arbiter of dispute, as in the courts, the ultimate judge is God, because God sees everything, right? God knows all, sees all. God created it all, right? In this theory. But we are mere mortals having to hash it out with each other in a temporal plane of existence called Earth. And while we play out our human lives and dramas, we become actors in this grand theater, actually. And so you have a person of stature in the community who is charged with the job of being the judge. So he sits up there at the altar or at the bench, so whatever they would call it then days, I don't know. And this is God's representation on earth, is the judge in this system where God has got the name Baal, right? Baal. And so in the ritualized system of today's modern courts, and this is almost all over the world, as I understand this, you could go to any country in the world, Muslim, Christian, African, South American, Russian, Canadian, New York State, they all have black robes, and the judge comes in and sits at the desk or at the altar or at the bench, and each of the players in this act, the actors are either state actors and have different roles to play in this unfoldment. And in order for the scales of justice to be weighed properly, it has to be, weighed with the evidence, and unless the evidence is truthful, you can't get a proper reading. I mean, if you're trying to weigh something with a broken scale, that's not really fair, is it? So at every point along the way, truth has to be maintained at all times. And this is where today you have a huge disparity You have a very vast cultural, economic, and physical distance between the very wealthy, and I'm measuring in wealth in this context as, 6 figures, 10 figures in a bank account somewhere in Switzerland, and the high-rise house and the second, third, and fourth, and fifth homes in the country, and whatever else that goes along with that level of wealth and position. Okay, and then you have the sometimes growing, sometimes shrinking, sometimes annihilated middle class that kind of supports that upper tier with their purchasing power, with their work, with their contribution to the system, whatever that may be. And then there's the have-nots. Then there's people who are in need. And in this huge, complex civilization we have today, the opportunity for the inappropriate or unfair use of economic tools over the middle class and the poor is unprecedented. We can't even begin to quantify what's going on behind the corporate veil. What's going on behind the scenes? Who owns our civilization? Who owns the corporations? And corporations occur in many forms. Some of them are municipalities. Some of these corporations are courthouses, courts. Some corporations are shipping corporations. Some corporations are wireless technology corporations. There's a lot of different kinds of corporations, but they all have the same business model. That business model is that there's a board of directors, that there's a chief financial officer, there's the executive officer, there's various other positions. There's, well, in the old days they'd call him the scribe. Today they'd call him the financial officer, I guess, or the treasurer, or any number of, the record keeper, the clerks, or whatever. There's different positions within any corporate board. But in any event, when you have a corporation and it has its corporate board, the corporate board has to answer to somebody. They're just the board of directors. And who they answer to are the shareholders. And this gets to be a real interesting thing, because now we have a system that was once really directly connected to the populace, to the governed, okay? In our constitutional form of government, the theory is that we are represented by elected representatives who are working towards representing our desires in the legislation, in the creation of laws that we all agree to and then abide by. And that makes a smooth running civilization. That's the theory of it. In the theory of the courts, they're supposed to be, run publicly, and these public operations aren't supposed to be vested with a profit motive. And that's all gone away. I don't know that we ever actually had a pure judicial system, even going back to Hammurabi or the Sumerians. What we have today, we have court systems that are commercial, and just because that they're commercial doesn't mean that they're good or bad. If a court is operating fairly and honestly, then the trade issues get settled and dispensed with properly. But then you have, and this is where the church gets really important in our construction of our legal system today. The church is really important because that they gave us the form of our courts. And the church's roots go back to Baal, no matter what church you are and what denomination. It really still all goes, there's all say, all roads lead to Rome. Well, actually, all roads lead to Babylon, kind of, in this concept. Anyway, so here we have a real problem. And that is that our system, our legal system, has evolved from canon law. And that canon law has its roots with the Romans and the Greeks. And that's where we get all of our legal language to this day, like to testify, all right? Well, what is an attorney? And why is it that an attorney can't testify? Well, that's because he wasn't there. He's representing somebody who was there. So in the original thing, attorneys were actors in Rome, ancient Rome. Or who even knows how ancient? It may have not even been a couple hundred years ago, because we don't know our real history, folks. That's a whole nother show. The problem is that you have this thing called a church. It comes in and it creates indulgences. What it does, what does indulgences mean? It means you can go and pay off your sins. And the penal code, the modern penal code, is designed and based on penance, penal code, penitence. And it's the quantification of crime. It used to be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now it's, okay, your eye is worth $35,000. Your tooth, it's only worth $10,000. And we're going to settle this dispute that way. All right? Okay, so the church quantified sin so that if you could pay for your sin, then God the judge, God the priest character, would say, okay, you're absolved of your sins. You got a clean slate. Now, go on out there and don't do that naughty stuff anymore. Otherwise, I'm going to have to charge you again. Okay? And that's why you are charged with a crime. That's why you are charged with a claim, because you're being billed. And the bill collectors work for the banks, because the banks are the ones who are the money changers that the judges are obedient to. Yeah, you had a thought there?
You see how dangerous it is? Because if it becomes a money-making operation, then the product is crime.
Oh, well.
Because that's the motivation.
Yes.
You're making more money if there's more crime. So it's not really run along and sin no more. It's run along, store up more money until you're worth charging again.
And then again, that gets back to all the naughty things you can do with money on the right side of the page there. That's part of that there, Paula. Anyway, I'm fidgeting with the tablecloth because it's slipping away from me, and I don't know why. Anyhow, there we go. There's so much more for me to talk about on this subject. And what I'm going to say to you people is that we're not safe with the present system right now. I know directly how I can describe for you.
George, we never were safe. That's what due process is. It was supposed to make an opportunity for real people to come on board to see if there were real crimes. Jurisdiction is always established by a harmed party. Not a bunch of guys in suits who are making up laws and say this is the charge for this being broken and that being broken.
Do no harm is there are two real the two pillars of justice is do no harm and tell the truth. Okay, those are the kind of like the two real big pillars here: do no harm, tell the truth. So, you know, in the situation that I'm involved with, my partner was harmed by the actions of the adversary, and consequently the law enforcement machinery that got put into play. See, and because, well, it's fictitious, maybe, but the boots on the ground reality is we do live in a police state. We do live in an information state, in a surveillance state, and a corporate state. You know, we have to understand.
But we have to pierce the corporate veil. You know, if you have a bucket full of snakes and you die of a heart attack, and then you find out you only perceived they were snakes, but they were ropes. They weren't snakes. It was just a bucket full of ropes.
Right.
But your perception saw snakes, and you got a heart attack. So the skill is to see it before you get the heart attack. That's what I mean.
Well, unfortunately, the kind of power that's the state has, and I always wondered, what is the state? Who are these people? You know, what gives the state the authority, the power to subject me to shackles and, you know, other dynamics?
It's supposed to be us, all of us.
Yeah.
But I believe we're misrepresented.
Oh, absolutely. And that's by design. So this evolution has brought us to this pinnacle now of privatization. All right. Now, this word, y'all have to really examine real hard what I'm looking at here. Cooper Lake is not off the table. Okay, folks? It's not off the table. Nestle is taking our entire planet's water supply and is claiming it for itself. All right? Water is not a right. Clean water is not a right. It's a privilege that you have to buy in a bottle marked Nestle's. Okay? So if you think that Cooper Lake's off the table, it's not off the table. They want our water. Yes.
Joe, I'm so glad you brought that up, because at the November Telecommunications Committee meeting that we had, the next meeting 2 weeks later, it never happened. But you know what did happen? A $12 million deal was being pitched for Cooper Lake here in, did you know that?
Yes, I am aware of that. And that's why, you know, everybody got lazy and thought that just because they shot down the pipeline aspect, that the game was over. It's not over, because what they'll just do is then they'll buy the lake and they'll just suck the lake up anyway.
Right.
So, yeah, somebody down in Kingston is probably going to get pressured. If you don't take the deal, then we're going to make you a deal you can't refuse. That kind of situation could probably very well be happening. I don't know.
That's why I think we're being tested now in the courts, if we can be strong enough to stand up against that kind of deception, because that's what it is.
Could be.
You know, Bill McKenna was at that meeting. He was not at the telecommunications meeting. Nobody was. Some people knew it was canceled, but the public, you know, it was never publicly known.
Right.
And it was advertised, you know, you remember when we were there, every Tuesday, you know, every blah, blah, blah. Well, it didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen. All right, so I got a few minutes left. I think about 4 minutes left. We started a little late tonight, folks. And I bit into a subject was pretty interesting. I thought the show would drag, but I've eaten a whole 55 minutes with you and barely scratched the surface of all that's brewing in my head. What do you think? Do you want to do a second hour? Or?
No, Joe's coming by to get me, but I'd like to end on support the producers board.
Well, yeah.
The producers is the real party of interest.
Getting back to that, folks, yeah, it is important. I'd like to keep doing shows. My circumstances are quite complicated at the moment, And, you know, I am a voter in Woodstock, and I manage the local movie theater, Upstate Films. And for all of you who support Upstate Films, thank you. Keep coming to the movies. It's a real nice thing to do. That's with people out and about, and not just staying at home watching the screen. You can come out and watch a real big screen and have fun that way. And that's a nice thing to do. But anyway,
And you're in the 25-mile radius, and that's the
am.
contract that was discussed on the November 4th telecommunications meeting
November 4th of...
of 2019. Jerry Washington brought that up about the expiring contract, but it hasn't expired yet. And with Time Warner, 25-mile radius.
And when was that contract expiring?
I don't know when it's expiring. It was re-signed on April 2011. It's on the town's website. People should look at it.
I think we should look at it. And that means, you know, that's a good, strong argument for me to bring back to Bill. I mean, I haven't had a chance to see Bill, you know, because he said he'd talk to me about this, you know, for a year now. I've just been consumed battling in the courts myself. And I've learned a lot, folks, and that's why I'm kind of talking about it tonight, that we are living in a system that's very ritualized, and it's based on privatization. And the thing is, folks, what you got to realize is that these systems, our judicial and law enforcement systems, get money from the corporations that now own and run the jails. So they don't like empty jails, because if they have empty jails, then they're not getting their taxpayer money to pay for the corporations that are running the jails. When it used to be the county ran the jail, or the state ran the jail, or the federal government ran the jail, and it was scrutinized, and all of that paper trail was part of the public record. And now you have a private paper trail, so we don't know what these prisons are doing with the money. And what it is, and with this kind of motivation to be putting people in prison, that is an opportunity to ignore truth and integrity and honesty in the working of our systems. So, on that note, thanks for tuning in and watching Conant Show, and hopefully I'll keep coming out and talking to the people and presenting some new ideas and some new stuff. I got lots of photography that I want you to see, lots of good stuff. All right.
Make it happen.
All right. Thanks, everybody.